Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to a great workshop series about advancing digital agriculture and conservation. My name is Sherry Rogie-Fiddler, and I'm President and CEO of Farm Foundation. This workshop comes at an important time when we're experiencing a mixture of gains and losses in conservation progress, paired with increasing but uneven adoption of digital agriculture. So we are so pleased that so many of you have joined us today for our discussion and hope that we may find ways to collaborate as a result of this series to help advance digital agriculture and conservation. For those of you who may not know us, Farm Foundation is an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture. Our mission is to build trust and understanding at the intersections of agriculture and society. And we accomplish this in a variety of ways, including by leveraging objective dialogue and creating multi-stakeholder collaboration. Our collaboration today is one such example. Farm Foundation has had the wonderful opportunity to collaborate with Stephen Wolf from Cornell University, Jonathan Koppas, and Kathy Bayless from the University of Illinois to bring you this series on digital ag and conservation. We want to thank them for their collaboration and also recognize and thank our corporate sponsors, Corteva Agriscience and Microsoft, for their generous support of this workshop series. We're excited to kick off this first session, but before we get started, I wanted to review some quick guidelines. Probably by now you're all getting used to Zoom webinars, but we do just want to cover a few housekeeping points here. So during the webinar, each participant will have their audio muted, and we really encourage you to submit questions throughout the whole presentation by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. There's a chat button, but the Q&A button is where you can put your questions in throughout the whole session. But please remember when you submit your questions to put your name and the company so that questions can be contextualized by the panelists here. And just to note that we might not get to all questions, but we encourage and hope for a very robust discussion time. The webinar will be recorded and we'll post it on our website afterwards. And just a reminder, again, you're probably familiar with these Zoom sessions, but if there is any connectivity issues, usually it will stabilize. So we just ask that you hang on and it will hopefully take care of itself. And just a reminder too, if you want to use a hashtag on social media, the hashtag is in the lower left-hand corner there, hashtag Digital Ag Workshop. So for this morning's workshop, we'll be hearing a few remarks from Stephen Wolf, Associate Professor at Cornell University, followed by our moderator, Kathy Bayless, Professor at University of Illinois, and our two keynote speakers. I'd like to extend a personal warm welcome to our two speakers today, who will be introduced soon, Jason Weller and Charles Barron, both of whom are tremendous innovators and leaders. After the speakers, we'll take time at the end for questions, and you can submit your questions, as I mentioned, online at any time during the presentation or the discussion this morning, as well as post on the collaboration section of the workshop website. And with that, I think I'll turn it over now to Stephen to further articulate our shared goals for this workshop. Stephen?
Thanks, Sherry. And welcome to all of you. I appreciate you joining us. And I want to thank Kathy and Jonathan and our sponsors, and of course, the Farm Foundation. In terms of how we got here, I can say that over 25 years ago, the Farm Foundation was one of the sponsors of a workshop I organized at University of Wisconsin around my dissertation, which was focused on precision farming and the advent of information-based or data-intensive services in agrochemical dealers and independent crop consultants, as well as the role of extension agronomists in the extension service from land-grant universities. And I've continued to study the way that data is mobilized and accessed and applied in agri-environmental policy in the US and Europe. And I think it's important to recognize that we've been anticipating a data revolution for a number of decades, and our conversation today is part of an ongoing process of realizing the potential of data, and we're not there yet. Sometimes data is too expensive, sometimes it's too messy to make sense of, sometimes we can't aggregate it because there's concerns about ownership and privacy, and sometimes I find that data is ignored because it's inconvenient with respect to accountability and discipline. And for all these reasons, it makes it an interesting topic from an academic perspective and a really important topic from a practical perspective. In terms of our objectives for the next 4 sessions, we're interested in trying to understand how policy levers can be mobilized to support innovation and generate and apply new tools and apply data more intensively to advance conservation and agriculture, both on-farm and off-farm. And secondly, we're interested in institutional change or policy change, and what do these new tools mean and capabilities mean for bringing data to bear. And last, we're interested in strengthening the science policy interface, and that represented through our partnership with academic institutions and agricultural institutions. And that starts with a conversation. I encourage all of you to be active throughout the 4 sessions. The webpage for this event has a forum feature under the collaboration tab. And I encourage you to push information, publications, links, and images to us and to one another, and to use the question and answer feature actively. And with that, I'd like to just simply recognize the Cornell Initiative for Digital Agriculture. You can visit our website to get an idea of what we're doing on campus. We're not alone. Over 100 faculty from 5 colleges, lots of exciting events involving external collaborators and students, and I encourage you to get involved. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kathy Bayless from the University of Illinois. Thank you.
Hi, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Today, we're very fortunate to have 2 speakers who are actually using digital agriculture to improve conservation outcomes and farmer outcomes. We're going to start off with Jason Weller. Jason is Vice President of Truterra at Land O'Lakes, and he used to be the Chief of USDA's NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and before that worked on the Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture, the White House OMB, as well as the House Budget Committee. So he's had lots of experience in DC, but also in the Midwest, working in terms of working for farmers on and on behalf of kind of trying to improve conservation outcomes. Jason, take it away.
Just a second, Jason. It looks like we're having some audio issues. If you can just unmute there.
Thank you. You'd think I'd have this down by now, having been 10 weeks with lockdown and spending 12 hours a day on Zoom. Good morning, everyone. Try this 3rd time. Really appreciate the invitation. Catherine, thank you very much for the introduction, and a good day to everyone. I can see from the invite list, there are a lot of current and former colleagues, both from USDA and across the ag industry, but particularly like to give a shout out to my USDA colleagues, folks from NRCS, of course, and ARS. There's a lot of great knowledge and firepower in today's session, and I appreciate the few minutes I have just to share some insights that I've learned from you all. And I also want to really credit the Farm Foundation, Cornell University, University of Illinois for setting up this workshop, not just today's session, but I really commend the topic and why I'm particularly excited and passionate about this. We'll get to here in the next few slides. But I really believe strongly, I feel it in my bones, that we are on the advent of the next evolution in sustainability and farm stewardship. And the topic that we're going to be discussing over the next several workshops is foundational to that next step, the next evolutionary step as we help farmers better steward their soils and their waters, and ultimately the broader suite of natural resources. So thank you for allowing me to spend some time this morning just to share a few words and to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Truterra at Land O'Lakes. So next slide, please. So notwithstanding the huge investment that the public has made into natural resource conservation, if you look at the macro scale, in many respects, what we're seeing is a diminishing returns. So what we see here is, this is coming out of the National Resources Inventory from NRCS, is that notwithstanding huge investments in conservation planning and in structural practices and good management practices, we really have not made the progress I think expected or hoped for just on the most basic intrinsic, in this case, indicator around erosion, both sheet and rill erosion and wind erosion. So over the last several decades, we have Please go back. So why is this? And how do we advance the results? So I think in part it's because we've tackled the large landscape approaches to soil erosion and soil conservation. And we've done a lot of great advancement, for example, in practices around conservation tillage and helping farmers understand how tillage and residue management is really foundational and important. But we've reached, I think, the limits of where we can go from a general planning standpoint, and we really have to unlock the power of our understanding of the soils, the understanding of agronomics, and ultimately get down to not just a farm scale or a field scale, but even at a subfield scale. Next slide, please. So this is out of USDA's Conservation Effects Assessment Project, CEP, as many will know the acronym. And this is a learning that I just kind of at the time blew my mind, and it's a general rule of thumb that just seems to happen time and again wherever you go in life, the 80-20 rule of thumb. So this is actually data out of the CEP assessment for the Western Lake Erie Basin. And it turns out in that large watershed that drains into the Maumee River, ultimately ending and terminating into the Lake Erie, about 25% of the acres are responsible for approximately 80% of the sediment loss, about 66% of the phosphorus loss, and about 59% of the nitrogen loss. And that's not 25% of the farms in that watershed, it's not 25% of the fields in that watershed. It's going to be about 25% of the acres. And it's every field in that watershed, ultimately, depending on the slope, the terrain, the topography, the unique soil types in those fields, ultimately, that's where the loss is occurring. And so how do we help farmers, farm managers, land managers, conservation planners, agronomists, really the experts that are working the land to grow crops and feed us and provide for rural vitality? How do we help these land managers identify in these large landscapes where this loss is occurring? And it's not just in the Western Lake Erie Basin. This is a learning that holds true across all watersheds of the United States to varying degrees. And so across the landscape, where do we go to find where we invest that marginal management dollar, that marginal additional management time to help advance the quality of the soils and ultimately the quality of the water and the natural resources in these large basins? Next slide, please. So really, the topic then is this. It's about precision stewardship, precision conservation, digital agriculture. And why I'm really passionate and excited is we've seen an explosion in the last 10 years in the capabilities and the new software and in remote sensing capabilities to ultimately identify in farm fields where these vulnerable acres reside and how we can help better manage them. So in this case, you can see in this slide, this is a farm field out of central Minnesota where there's great, in this case, diversity in nitrogen use efficiency. So there's high variability across this field in NUE, and that factors in pounds of nitrogen per bushel produced. So you can see it varies anywhere from 1.3 pounds of nitrogen all the way down to 0.8 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So helping the farmer first understand that diversity in nitrogen use efficiency across this field is a big win in the gain. But also it turns out that variability in water erosion also holds true across that field, where there's huge rates of changes in sheet and rill erosion, anywhere from close to 10 tons per acre per year, which is catastrophic, down to less than half a ton per acre per year. So again, beyond then just erosion and nitrogen use efficiency is profitability. And how do you help the farmer beyond yield maps and NDVI imagery understand where they're making money in the field and where they're losing money? And more often than not, where they're losing money is where you see erosion occurring, where you see leaching or runoff occurring. And where you start to stack these insights, you can better help the farmer understand how to improve their return on investment, how to help improve their crop fertility and crop success, but also tie that improved management and targeting the stewardship practices in a way that ultimately is going to enhance the environment. Next slide, please. So why are we not seeing broader adoption of these kind of conservation, precision ag, digital conservation tools? So at a high level, there are many experts on the call today, and over the workshop, you're going to hear from a lot of great folks who have deep insights into this. But in general, our learnings through Land O'Lakes and my time here with the True Terra team, I just tried to summarize a few what I see challenges to adoption. So the first is, what is the value proposition? The value proposition in this case to the farmer, the land manager. And invariably, particularly when it comes to sustainability, to conservation, the first question a farmer will ask, particularly these days, is what's in it for me? What's the ROI? How does this help better manage my farm? what is my return on the dollars you're asking me to spend? And for the additional conservation practices that you're advocating, I take a look at or maybe adopt, again, it has to have a bottom line return to the producer. And that holds true to a lot of the digital agricultural tools. Secondly, a big barrier to adoption, and a question, the second invariable question farmers will ask, is about trust. Who's using my data? Where does the data go? Who has access to it? And they have, particularly these days, a lot of concern about once the data is shared, where that ultimately ends up and who has access to it. In some cases, it's going to be, there's concern about neighbors or other farmers getting access to it. It could be access to government agencies and regulators getting access to their data. It could be even to the private sector companies. There's just ultimately a lack of trust because they first don't necessarily see or intuit the value for sharing the data. The third is tech adoption, which is again a core component of the workshop that we're going to be visiting on over the next several sessions. And I really commend, there's a publication that came out recently called Trust in Food, which is an initiative of the Farm Journal and ultimately supported in partnership with the Sustainability Consortium. I really commend this organization. They had some really interesting insights about farmer adoption, and they did a survey of about 390 growers. And the results they got back, I think, were highly illuminating. So first, out of the farmers they assessed, more than 60% didn't even use software. They were not using digital agriculture to manage their farms. So that right there unlocks a real barrier to adoption of sustainability and using precision stewardship practices. And as a result, even among those that did use it, that roughly 40% that did use digital ag, about 70% of those reported that they didn't get all their needs met. And even more alarmingly, only 93% of those that were using digital ag tools reported they were not using them for sustainability or for conservation. So clearly we have a lot of opportunity here to expand the use and adoption, but ultimately this is about a tech adoption barrier. And we can create the most insightful and impactful tools, particularly for conservation, but we first need to unlock the value proposition and address the trust barrier, but ultimately how do we get these tools in the hands of farmers? There's an expense component, which is ultimately how does the producer pay for it or who pays for these tools? And that in itself is a big challenge. And ultimately, because these tools are not cheap and they can be expensive to deploy, but beyond deployment, there's also the cost of the data collection. And this is a hugely challenging barrier for any in the industry, but how you get high quality, repeatable, scalable data that ultimately can be used to drive real value back to the farm. And this is something where I'm very excited. There's a lot of innovation around and a lot of brilliant people working on those kind of questions. But the current approach we have today is very difficult to be repeatable and ultimately to generate high quality data at the scale I think that's needed. And the final barrier is really about segmentation. It's ultimately understanding the customer. And farmers are people, and they're just like any one of us. They all have preferences, they have priorities, and they have their own philosophies and business approaches on how they manage their farms. And so they're going to be early adopters. There's going to be those that are interested and intrigued and want to be part of this early adoption of these kind of tools. And they're going to be farmers that, for a variety of reasons, it could be for expense and for capital, or just for their preference on how they manage their farms, are not going to be necessarily open to using these tools because they believe very passionately or very firmly that their management is successful and they have the tools that they need currently to be a great farmer and to be successful. Next slide, please. Beyond challenges with adoption, I was asked to talk briefly about risks. And the risks, I think, are obviously related with challenges to adoption. There's a regulatory component. So this is really going to be more the farmer's voice here, reflecting back to us. And the risks is how will the data and how will these tools be used ultimately to regulate agriculture broadly, and how will they be used to regulate farmers specifically? And this is a real risk that I think farmers rightly ask hard questions about and expect clear, plain-spoken answers on. And I'll be honest, in the industry, we have been a little bit meal-mouthed on this. We need to be more direct and more fulsome, and I think lean in and really be clear and articulate passionately. This is about the preservation of farm privacy and maintaining their independence. And these are not going to be tools necessarily that are going to be used against the farmers who are asking to use these tools. There's also the perception, I think in some cases real, that these tools are being used to profit others, but not necessarily the farmer. So we're, in this case, engaging the farmer and asking them to share data, but the benefits of these insights are ultimately accumulating downstream off the farm. And we need to ensure, and we really need to maintain, I think, a philosophy and ethos about always working with the farmer first and ensuring that the value from these tools start with the farm and are really returning investment of value and insights and improved management and improved success for the farmer. There's absolutely risk of overpromise that, we're always saying we have the next best bread slicer, but in many cases, a lot of these tools don't necessarily meet what with the promise. And that creates, I think, a risk of adoption in the future, where if you overpromise results and underdeliver, that also creates, I think, a bad brand name or bad experience for the producer. And that experience will be shared with other farmers, I assure you. A lot of these tools can be very complicated. And for farmers and farm managers that are asked to do a ton, they're asked to be everything from an agronomist to a veterinarian to a mechanic to an engineer to a software engineer. That's a lot we're asking an individual to take on. And so we need to find a way to how do we weave these kind of capabilities into their existing management systems and not overcomplicate it. And the final risk is really about credibility. And if we say, these tools are generating insights, we have to ensure those insights and those recommendations ultimately create value for the farmer and that are real, that are not going to be imagined or promised. And ultimately, if we don't deliver on those promises, it erodes or can really destroy the credibility of our approach on enhancing conservation and sustainability. Next slide. So what are we doing at Land O'Lakes? Land O'Lakes has a sustainability business called TruTerra. TruTerra is a sustainability team, very proud to be part of at Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes, for those who don't know, is a very large farmer cooperative. And so we're very proud of the fact that we are the only farmer-owned, farmer-driven sustainability program in the United States. And we're very passionate about who we work for. I love the fact when I wake up in the morning, I know I work for the American farmer. And my job is to create value for that farmer and return that value to them first and foremost. And so for our sustainability team, we really are magnetic north, and our focus and our passion is about how do we create value and insights for our farmer owners on how to improve the stewardship of their soils, their crop inputs, and ultimately how does that benefit water quality, water quantity, address climate change, and ultimately help their bottom line by improving their profitability and return on investment on their fields. Next slide. So why is that for us really important? So this is a results out of a survey produced by the Journal of Soil Water Conservation. And when they surveyed farm producers, corn growers, about 2,000 corn growers in the Corn Belt in the United States, they asked, who do you turn to for your advice? So it could be advice on your inputs, on a technology, on your farm management. And invariably, it doesn't really matter the survey. What farmers say is they trust where they get their inputs from their fertilizer and ag chemical dealer, from their seed dealer, but also from other farmers. And so TruTerra, we work through our farmer cooperative system. We're actually a federated co-op. So Land O'Lakes itself is owned by over 900 farmer cooperatives in independent ag retailers across the United States. And through that federated system, Land O'Lakes, the Land O'Lakes family of farmers touches about 50% of the harvested acres in the United States. And so TruTerra is building out a sustainability program through that network of local farmer co-ops. And we're designing sustainability services for those retailers, for those cooperatives that in turn take to their farmer owners. Next slide, please. So what we offer is the TruTerra Insights Engine. The TruTerra Insights Engine is our business's sustainability platform. It is our precision stewardship technology. And in that, we offer 3 core services today. The first is a stewardship score, which is a numeric rating of the level of farm conservation, farm stewardship management in each field on that farm. And with that, we give them deep insights into the risks on that field, risks of leaching, of runoff, of erosion, but also other key performance indicators, such as your sheet and roll erosion, your wind erosion, your soil carbon trends, your greenhouse gas emissions, and your nitrogen sufficiency. And it's a live interactive sandbox where farmers in real time can plug and play different practices and see how improving your 4R approach to nitrogen stewardship, how enhancing your tillage operations, incorporating cover crops, installing up to 26 different conservation practices that are recommended by NRCS, how that suite approach, that system approach for conservation can enhance your stewardship rating, but also key performance indicators in that field. The second main component is profit insights, where we're showing the farmer how that system approach for stewardship can enhance the profitability. So we're helping the farmer actually visualize where that field is making money and where it's losing money. And so we're helping the farmer manage the field actually like a business, and where you have a profit center, double down on the profit through enhanced management, where you have borderline returns, how you can tweak your system to overall help that farm acreage enhance its sustainability or in profitability, but also where a farm field is underperforming, perhaps finding a different use for that portion of the field, and ultimately taking that high-risk acreage out of production and maybe enrolling into the Conservation Reserve Program, or installing a wetland, or putting it into pasture or into alfalfa. And the third component is precision soil insights, where we're providing high-resolution, deep insights around erosion, but also, next slide, please, giving them understanding, I think, first in the industry, deep understanding of soil health trends in the field. So what you're seeing here is we can do live scenarios for the farmer on their current management, like conventional till, or moving into a mulch-till system or reduced till system, and visualizing how you're improving the soil health in your field. Where it's that red, it's where your soil organic matter and soil carbon is going to be declining, and where it's green, you're actually going to be attenuating and increasing your soil organic matter and soil carbon trends in that field. So we're bringing this system, this package of insights to the farmer, which is allowing for field-by-field management. But beyond the field scale, we can then roll up the results on a macro scale. Next slide, please. So we're showing, this is farmers are enrolled in the system today in 3 states in the Midwest. We're across 19 states nationally, but just focusing on Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. This is showing about 900 farmers across close to over 880,000 acres. So a significant footprint just in the upper Midwest here. But beyond that footprint, next slide, please, we can start to roll up macro level insights. So for example, cover crop adoption. So across this area, we can now track adoption. So we're showing about 8% of acres in cover crops. And on a county scale, we are starting to see where high cover crop adoption is occurring. We can start to also then report trends on a macro scale. So beyond just the field scale, we can then show across whole states, counties, watersheds, different regions of the US, practice adoption. Next slide, please. But beyond cover crops, we also can show conservation practice adoption. So as I said, we're tracking 26 conservation practices, and we can show the current level of penetration of these core conservation practices, but also then be able to target and focus with partners, additional practice adoption, and how this is ultimately rolling up to outcomes. Next slide, please. And the outcomes can include, for example, what are the current rates of sheet and roll erosion? We can show macro level results on greenhouse gas, on soil carbon, nitrogen use efficiency, wind erosion, a whole myriad of different outcomes that we can scale in any direction. We can go down to the micro, down to a 3x3 meter grid in the field, up to a national continental scale, and really show conservation trends and also outcomes in a way that I think is really exciting and allows us to work with partners to better focus and target conservation results. Last slide, please. What I will end on this is, of course, is a thank you, but a final statement is to be absolutely clear. This is not about any one company or technology. We have intentionally designed this to be farmer facing, but we've also intentionally designed this to complement the investments and the firm foundation that USDA and the university system and extension have created. We're very cognizant and we're very fortunate to have these public investments and to have professionals that are continuing to build that foundation. And all the results that we've been able to share with you today are a result of, first, from the science to the tools to the data, are a result of public investment and public leadership. And Truterra is very proud to continue to work with the public. And we see this as truly a public-private collaboration where we understand in the end, you can build all the tools you want, you can put all the apps you want on a phone or computer, but it ultimately will take a human to go talk to a farmer to advance the next step. And that's where I think a really great public-private partnership in this advent of the new stage of conservation, I think that's really what's exciting, is we're putting the hands and the tools of both public servants as well as agronomists and farmers together to work together to advance the success of the American farmer, but also to better steward our natural resources. So with that, I will hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jason. That was great. I want to turn things over now to Charles Barron, who co-founded the Farmer Business Network after a stint at Google, trying to improve productivity and marketing options for farmers. And Charles, why don't you take it away?
Well, thank you, and good morning to everyone. And thank you very much to the Farm Foundation team and to Stephen and Catherine and Jonathan. And thank you for those great remarks by Jason. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about FBN and what it is. It's still, maybe new to many folks in the audience, and then, how we're working to advance sustainability and how we see the risks and opportunities here in digital ag and conservation. We're a company that was born in digital agriculture, and I'll explain how that works in just a second. Next slide. So what FBN is we are a network of growers, and we exist to give growers the ability to generate price transparency, product performance, and then also purchasing in a new system online, very transparent and direct to farm. Next slide. And fundamentals of that are to improve producer profitability. So this is a little bit of our footprint where we 6 years ago with a handful of farms who wanted to share data with each other for better learnings and getting more market power. We're now over 11,300 farms across 38 million acres around the US and Canada, and we're also now in Australia. And the core of that is that how farmers participate in FBN is they either use the system to purchase or they use it to share information, share data. And so they will actually voluntarily contribute agronomic data, detailed field record histories, precision data, and then we combine that information with other sources of information like satellite, like soil data, other public source and open source pieces of data that allow us to then aggregate and benchmark information. So farmers can benchmark themselves compared to other growers in the network. They can see the detailed operational performance of their own fields and all the way down to the products. And it allows us to both compare farms, but also help introduce products and test products and test services and allow farmers to market in new ways, all enabled by that data collection system and sharing system through the FBN network. Next slide, please. Just a bit about the business so you understand how it works. We are a network, and so we provide a combination of services from input sales online through things like seed and farm fertilizers and crop protection to crop marketing services. We help growers market their grains. We also have full sustainability programs and specialty buyer programs for things like non-GMO and organics. We combine that with our analytics system. We do everything to undergird the farm, which includes farm lending, crop insurance, and even health insurance for growers. And then around that is the FBN community of growers. We have a very, very active online community where growers share information and share tips and tricks about how to solve specific on-farm problems. Next slide, please. So the way I like to think about it, and the way I like to think about what digital agriculture can do for the world, is to think about it from the standpoint of what would you do if you had a 230 million acre plot trial, and what kinds of insights could you generate if you had field records from that vast amount of data? Because that is in fact what FBN members have created. They voluntarily submitted that data. They've shared it with each other in the platform in order to get access to the aggregated intelligence. And so from that, you can create enormously impactful and insightful learnings. Next slide, please. Another way to think about that is the speed of learning. And this is one of the great aspects of digital agriculture. The speed of learning is so vastly accelerated when you hit with that scale of information. And we talk about in farming the 40 chances that a farmer has to optimize and perfect their craft. We estimate in the FBN system that our members have contributed the equivalent of 25,000 years of experience and field experience into the system through that data. And I'll show you how that then translates into capabilities. Okay, next slide. One of the flagship things that a grower can do with data in FBN is what we call FBN Seed Finder. It's aggregated data on about 5,400 seeds. It helps growers optimize the performance of those seeds, place them on fields, see their true response to population, even goes seed by seed and can show the nitrogen utility and utilization of every seed and how efficient that seed is in certain soil types at utilizing nitrogen. So it actually can go hybrid by hybrid, genetic by genetic, and figure out optimal soil placement and how it's going to utilize resources. We also provide price transparency, genetic relabeling intelligence, and a precise targeting tool that then uses that network intelligence to place that hybrid optimally on the right acre. Next slide, please. A system we just introduced this year is automated strip trials. So again, this is some of the things that are possible when a farmer is using a full precision system. So if they are running variable rate fertilizer and chemical on their, or planting on their farm, it's automatically getting captured in the FBN system. Any variation in product or test of a product is getting captured, it's getting measured, and it spits it back to the grower very quickly, so they can see instantly, basically, how those different product applications impacted yield or any other variable that they want to measure there. Next slide. Here's an example of one of the things we've started to do with that, which is now actually being, just like we've done with seed, being able to look at fertilizer products, being able to look at chemical applications, and actually look at how do both differences in rate and products actually compare in field. So all of this at a macro level and an aggregate level helps growers get better intelligence on the farm. We're in day 75 of bringing your kids to work day. So, Allison, okay, one sec. Can you take a seat? Okay, so next slide. One of the other things that we're doing is, here, honey, do you want to sit down?
No,
Daddy's gonna talk. Daddy's gonna talk here.
Let's bring your kid to screen day.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, so one of the other things we've done is creating a new, yeah, turn it off. One of the other things we've done is created a new system for the way genetics are actually developed and distributed to the farm. So we've called it the F2F genetic system. Our farmers participate in that by sharing data back. We can breed seed faster, bring it out to the farm. We're now on over 1,000 farms with this program. Next slide. And we have a full spectrum marketing system as well. So I'll explain how all this connects for sustainability, because really for us, it's about being able to take a grower all the way from the genetics to the market and manage every step in the process for them, help them along the way, and create markets that will ultimately get them rewarded for their practices and get them rewarded for what they're doing uniquely on their fields. Next slide. So, I think the great opportunity of digital agriculture is really creating a system that provides growers with economically better outcomes while delivering conservation and sustainability benefits. That's what we all want. Farmers have to be profitable. They have to be able to manage their businesses for the long term. And at the same time, we have to do that in a way that doesn't impede their ability to produce sustainably and manage the soils for generations to come. And so ultimately, those two value systems of profitability and sustainability have to be brought into concert in the long run. And for us, that means fundamentally a tremendous future where farmers can differentially market based on their attributes, based on what's unique about their farm or their fields or their crops, based on enabling food manufacturers to purchase regenerative or sustainability benefits or conservation benefits at scale. They can select based on the attributes that are going to be most.
It's because there's a daddy long legs on the couch.
Okay.
And there's also a daddy long legs on my roof and my room.
What's that? Okay. And fundamentally enabling consumers to know where their food comes from.
I'm watching How to Train Your Dragon
okay.
now.
Next slide, please, Chris. We're early in California, so I've woken up my house. So, on the risk side, this is probably, for us, when we look at this,
Daddy
we don't
won't let me shave his beard.
Alice. On the risk side, one of the big things here is making sure that growers actually get rewarded. The technology is really not so much the impediment. It's really the marketing and the implementation. So, really fundamentally, our CPG company is going to offer enough premium to make sure that farmers actually get paid. There's no definition of sustainable or regenerative ag. It's a real struggle. Farmers are all speaking different language. The market's speaking different language. One of the big opportunities, I think, which is also a risk, is that there's no standardized soil test and reporting system. And the foundational data sets that we've been able to build FBN on, a lot of them have been public. The Surgo soil data sets the base maps developed by USGS for elevation and terrain. These are fundamental systems that anyone can access, and they enable tools like FBN to be built that have been very, very powerful. That's, for us, that's a real opportunity. There's also no clearinghouse of field data at scale. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some of the quick things that we're doing about this, we've started developing regenerative programs to help producers get paid for practices and actually start connecting those two big participants in the market. Connecting the CPG companies who are ultimately the largest end user of the food, and then directly with the field practices on the farm in a way that's all measured and attributable back to specific practices for that grower. Next slide. I don't think anyone here needs to be explained why sustainability is important. You obviously have huge trends in consumer preferences, cultural values, different consumer sets between the coast and the middle of the country, and you also have fundamental needs in sustainability to meet the environmental needs of the country. Next slide. One of the big concepts that I think is really important to understand is the way we approach it is that commodities are really not commodities when they're on the farm. They're a commodity once they go into the bin, once they're mixed with everyone else's crop, then they become undistinguishable from one another. But while they're in the field, they are unique. They're unique by the practices that farmer used. They're unique relative to the genetics that were used. They're unique as the story of that farm. And those are all things that are marketable by a farm. The farm could take advantage of them if a system enabled them to. And so our view is that we fundamentally have to create a system that allows growers to market based on attributes and allows the market to turn around and purchase those attributes at scale from the grain system. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, one of the fundamental challenges here is that you don't have standardized languages, definitions, industry standards around these issues. So you don't have a standard definition of what is sustainable. You don't have a standard definition of what is regenerative. And reporting is very, very arduous. You have a number of different tools that have been out there. You have a number of different systems. And one of the great opportunities here is to make that easy, make the reporting easy and simple, make it automated through data collection, and then connect those directly into market mechanisms. Next slide. Let's see. Yep, there we go. Okay, so here's our vision. Here's how we're approaching it. We really want to play the role of being able to be a facilitator, being a clearinghouse for that information. We're already doing the work to collect millions of acres and process millions of acres of data. We work with buyers, we work with producers, and so we've been developing partnerships to play that connective tissue. And we see enormous potential in being able to do it, both as a business, but ultimately for the producers and for the consumer companies who are purchasing that. And that means incorporating and working with our partners in nonprofits and government research agencies, extension offices, and our members, and connecting them ultimately to the market with real buying and transacting opportunities based on sustainability. Next slide. So one of the big issues is why are buyers willing to pay more? And if there's any CPG companies in the audience today, please, we'd love to speak to you. But fundamentally, you have a new consumer in the millennial and Generation Z. You have major companies like Walmart and McDonald's who face major investor and activist pressure around their practices. You have companies of all types, whether it's meat companies or other food companies who need to speak credibly about their supply chain and the responsibility that they're taking in the grain system. And then lastly, you have fear of regulation. A lot of folks just simply need to make sure they're managing the issue in preparation for some potential regulation that could be coming and not get caught flat-footed. Next slide. So the practices that we've been able to reward growers for so far have been no-till or other tillage practices, nitrogen efficiency practices, as Jason talked about at length, cover crops, nitrogen usage, manure applications, and buffer zones. Next slide. So now I can actually talk a little bit about our program with Tyson Foods. So this is very exciting. So Tyson came to us and basically said they needed help calculating, tracking, and managing the footprint of their grain supply. As a large meat processor, they are consuming an enormous amount of grain from millions of acres and needed a method to be able to capture and analyze that. So we started a program with them in the Environmental Defense Fund that allows us to work with FBN members directly to score their practices and help them get paid for enrolling in that system, both on measurement and reporting. It's anonymized, so the grower never shares data with Tyson. It's just then turned into an attribute that FBN can measure and report out to Tyson. Right now, it's a 400,000 acre program with 117 farms. They don't actually have to be in direct proximity to Tyson, so they don't have to be selling. It can be done virtually. They could be in Colorado. Tyson facility could be in Arkansas. But Tyson can be tracking on that acre in Colorado, representing the equivalent grain. And the data that we're using is, again, primarily collected through the FBN data collection system and a quick online reporting survey. And next slide. That grower can get paid an average, it's a per acre fee, an average of $1,300 to $2,600 per year. They can get it in cash or they can get a reduction in cost of goods. We think it takes about an hour or less. We help you. And then the grower is not obligated to adopt any changes, but they get additional benefits if they do. And so that's really part of the system, is that creating a market mechanism that rewards the grower directly for the practices that they're undertaking and then those that they can consider. And the fundamental thing is, as Jason talked about, in terms of the what's in it for me for a farm, you have to remember a lot of practices are expensive to make the changeover. They take time to switch a farm over to no-till or conservation till. They take learning. And they take far more in cost than right now we're able to deliver in this program. But ultimately, we think the rewards are going to be worth it. And that's not only from the reduction in cost that the farm's going to be able to achieve once they've got a more sustainable practice, but also I think long-term in the market mechanism they'll be able to access. Next slide. We also have a program. It's a smaller program. It's a pilot program with Unilever around durum wheat in North Dakota. It's using the FieldPrint field to market calculator, and it's supporting their pasta brand. We have a few others in the works that are not yet public. Some of them are going to be tremendously exciting. But again, our model is fundamentally about bringing direct market benefits back to the grower so they can get paid for what they're doing. Ultimately, the grower has got to have a way to get paid in this market from creating these benefits. Otherwise, they will continue to face the adoption challenges of managing these entities, doing these change management practices on their own economic merits. Next slide. Actually, you can skip ahead 2 slides. And next slide. So we have a number of others in the works. With that, I will probably end. But yes, I would just echo a lot of the things Jason said, especially at the end, about the value of public information and public data sets. I think, to me, there's one data set that has been more of a barrier than any in doing this at scale, which is standardization around soil test. So we have Surgo, we can get soil types, we can get soil textures. It is incredibly difficult to standardize soil test between all the different labs. They use sometimes different techniques or processes. They're reporting the same values, but they're not usually directly comparable. And there's also no standard API. They're not common. It's difficult to go out and get that information at scale. That is a real role that we believe a public agency could provide. So that would be one thing that I've been saying for years, which we would just love to see, is a standardization around soil test data, which then would allow us to go at a very fine scale into field by field basis for doing nutrient measurement, benchmarking, reporting at scale. But with that, thank you. We think there's an incredible opportunity. We think that fundamentally benefits growers, and it's about creating a new system that makes producers more profitable while making the world better off, and ultimately getting consumers the food they want in the ways they want it, in a way that they can know and have a better connection back to the farm. So thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you. That was great, Charles. And I think there's a number of comments of parents in the audience who are sympathetic in the human data interaction that you were able to demonstrate. I want to turn to questions, and folks, please keep the questions rolling in. I think we're going to try and go over maybe about 15 minutes just to try and get a few more questions in, but we understand if people need to drop out on the hour. We will also try and share all the questions with the panelists so that things that don't get answered now can get answered later, as well as in the forum. So just a note, please do check the website, etc., before you lead off this, or before you head off. The whole point of this is to try and start a conversation in this space and to encourage future work and future sort of advancement of these technologies and these approaches. So one question that a number of folks wanted to hear answered was basically, how do we communicate long-term benefits of adopting these kinds of practices, so versus the kind of the short-run benefits? And then as a corollary to that, what do you both think is missing in terms of, particularly on the sort of public policy side or the public side, in terms of helping either create value or create or sort of lower the barriers to adoption of some of these methods?
So I'll take a first run at that. So we have intentionally designed our tool really to be complementary to the practices and the management techniques that the conservation community and the agronomy community recommends. And the challenge has been communicating the economic ROI. So there's a lot we can show in our tool around farm, field, and even subfield profitability, but it's going to be just that current year. And what's different about, and there's been a lot of questions around definition of regenerative agriculture. I come from a background at NRCS. You can take the boy out of NRCS, not the NRCS out of the boy. I prefer to talk about soil health. And the foundation, the concepts in soil health, improving the function and the quality of the soils, really is a long-term investment. And I think there are organizations that are investing a lot of research and into trials and collecting the data and doing the analytics on what's the ROI over the long term from improving the health of your soils. But it's not a one-year return on investment proposition. That's something that has a longer time horizon, 3, 5, 10 years. So as farmers adopt these systems, how do we help them on that adoption journey and that transition into a more soil health system? So while our tool and platform can show immediate returns on investment with reducing erosion, beginning to improve your soil organic matter, to show that ROI for that single crop year, the challenge to the community and many on this call is how do we communicate to the farmer what's the ROI 5 years in the future or 10-year time horizon? And that's not just cash, that can be also other risks that you're attenuating, about yield variability, about prevent plant reduction. There's a lot of other positive incentives, but how do we communicate that in a way that ultimately protects credibility? That we can't be promising things to a producer that isn't grounded in very sound science and in repeated trials. And that's a challenge I know a lot on this call are working on, but other organizations are also really working a lot on. In terms of public policy, I think then that weaves into public policy. And I think USDA generally and NRCS specifically has a lot of great tools already on the table. They have great programs. They have, I think, the world's best conservation practice standards. But it's thinking a little more creatively about how do we put those practice standards to work as a system and to either de-risk or incentivize the farmer. And to me, for these soil health practices, these really positive system approach of managing the soils and ultimately manage for crop success, there are 4 primary barriers. And the first is going to be education. So just giving the producer the knowledge and having a trusted, credible source of information. The second barrier is that agronomic advisor, that year-over-year consultant, someone they can turn to, because they are in the end just kind of an army of one. And so they need someone who has a lot of broad experience to help them manage year over year. The third is financial. And so there's going to be a capital cost where a lot of these practices and technologies and equipment are very expensive. So it's an upfront capital outlay, but they're also a financial cost in this case, because many of these systems actually induce risk there can be a yield drag, or because you're changing your management systems. It's a lot of additional change that ultimately can invite risks into the farm. And the fourth barrier is really cultural. And when you're the only grower in a county or in a community that has moved into your farming dirty, your fields look messy, that can be a real, for many producers, that can be stressful because you don't have another grower to go turn to. And so I think public policy should focus on how do you knock down those pins? What are the incentives? And what is the ultimate support that the public agencies and university systems can provide to help the farmers address those four main barriers?
Thanks, Jason. Charles, did you want to jump in?
You know, on the long term and incentivizing for the long term, I think, you know, I really think about it from the market standpoint, and really it comes down to the willingness to pay of consumers. And the ability to generate really material financial rewards back to the farm are going to come from the ability to translate consumer buying preferences into premiums that can get to the farm. So many companies, you know, are managing against ESG goals around reporting. Those programs can come through and can have a driver to need to report and track. But the premium doesn't get all the way back to the grower. And I think you do see it in specialty products and things like non-GMO or organic or you know, other types of specialty meats. You see it where those premiums do translate back into real premiums back to the farm. And you know, what we've seen is remarkable interest from farmers in doing this when you have a real financial incentive. So all of our programs have been oversubscribed. We could probably fill them up with a multiple of the growers we have on the platform today. One thing I didn't mention was in some survey data we have done with our own farms, 70% of our members said sustainability or regenerative ag was a number one or number two priority of their farm for the long term. It was one of the top things they were wanting to manage against. And so I think there's enormous, you know, fundamental interest in growers in doing this. It is ultimately, can they get paid in a way that, as Jason said, helps them manage through this transition, because there's risks, there's fears, or there's just a knowledge gap. But once they punch through that and have a real strong, very strong motivation to do it, they're all ready and able to do it.
Thanks, Charles. Another question that came in is asking about how to incorporate, or whether you're incorporating sort of climate projections into your network, and sort of how to think about that.
Well, we haven't been incorporating them into our network just yet, but you know, again, I think going back to you know, the value of soil data and what does soil data, the capabilities of having that kind of information open up. It obviously opens up information that you can do about sequestration at scale. It opens up about nutrient management at scale. It opens up the ability to better target and develop genetics that are hyper-localized for each field to get the most out of the nutrients that are in the soil. So I think there's really just a fundamental need for standardization there, or to have a standard reporting system or standard APIs that labs reported into. So growers, you know, one thing we found, it is incredibly difficult for a grower to get their soil data. So they will go through a retailer or a consultant. They will get a fertilizer application done, which usually includes a grid sample. And then they may never get the actual file, the actual geospatial file that has the records. In fact, they have to ask for it, and typically they don't even know where that file is. And the retailer often doesn't want to give it to them, and so on and so forth. So getting even the grower to get access to that information that is there is difficult. And then having it, you know, a step further where it's hard for a third party like FBN to go to a lab and get that information is even makes it even more difficult. So having more mechanisms there would be greatly helpful.
Thanks, Charles. Jason, did you want to comment?
So the broader topic on climate change, as Charles has talked about, is certainly key. And we ourselves are also working with a lot of we call downstream partners, downstream companies. And that includes Campbell Soup Company, Tate & Lyle, And through the Tate & Lyle partnership, we work with Coca-Cola and PepsiCo and Unilever. We're working with Cargill, Nestle Purina. And all of these companies are looking for a partner to help them achieve ultimately their science-based climate goals. And this is about, from their supply chains, reducing their inputs and ultimately their impacts to the environment and broadly to the climate. But what is important is how do you then communicate that back to the grower? And so I think what's unique is that we're bringing a tool suite that puts the farmer in control. They're literally and figuratively in the cab of their combine and their planner. And how do we advise them ultimately on the core system of practices that will be beneficial to their farm? Again, it comes back to that ROI. How does the farmer ultimately be more successful as a business person, as an enterprise? But then connect that farmer to a broader supply chain solution around climate change. And again, a lot of the practices that Charles has talked about with regenerative ag, with soil health practices, also are about ultimately improving the resiliency of those farms. So yes, I completely agree with Charles as well. This ultimately, how do we help the farmer get paid and compensated, incentivized for the other assets, for the other commodities that farmers producing? In this case, beyond the grain and fiber they produce, it can also be the carbon sequestration, the improved water quality, the net greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and how do we ultimately connect farmers to buyers of those additional assets? And that's really, I think, exciting, and that's where this whole digital revolution is, I think, we're finally on the forefront of starting to solve. But foundationally, intrinsically, we have to help the farmer understand the value first. So you can have all the science-based goals you want to create, but if you're not connecting real results to the farmer, it's going to be very difficult to achieve those broader system-based, system-wide goals.
Thank you. There was a question about sort of transferability across platforms, and that's, I think, goes to both speakers, and that there's now multiple tools being sort of established for trying to facilitate this sort of getting value to farmers from conservation activities. Are you thinking about sort of how to connect among platforms?
Yes, data is the currency, right? It's her digital revolution, and as we both have talked about, getting the data first and foremost, even having access to data is very expensive. Having it be high quality data is very expensive and difficult, and having it be repeatable year over year is also very challenging and difficult. So we've built our technology, the Truterra Insights Engine, inside of what's called the data silo, which is Land O'Lakes' digital platform that has APIs to a variety of different platforms, John Deere, Climate Field View, of course, Land O'Lakes' proprietary systems, EFC's Field Analytics, a variety of different ERP management systems. So the overall goal is to make it very easy. With the farmer's permission, the farmer can then connect all the machinery and software systems they're using and essentially automatically share all that data into the data silo, so they'll have access to that year over year, so they'll have the records going forward. But then again, with the farmer's permission, they can then connect that data with tools like the Insights Engine, where we can then repurpose that data beyond just tracking NDVI imagery and yield results. We can then add new value to that data stack that ultimately allows them to give them X-ray vision into their soils, go what's happening under the soil profile, but ultimately start to plan different conservation solutions on their farms using that same data. And I see some questions also on the list here about connections to other platforms like Field to Market. Yes, for every field in our system, we have close to 30,000 fields currently in Truterra. All of them have a field print calculator score on them. So we're connecting to Field to Market's platform as well, in addition to all the other results that we're creating. And we're looking at other integrations. So yes, there's been questions about nutrient tracking tool. Yes, that's something we're exploring. Ultimately, we want to be able to take the same data and repurpose multiple times, including generating carbon credits and other assets. But we want to go and start with a strategy that you get the data once, you get the data you need, and then you repurpose that same data pack multiple times for maximum value for the farmer.
Thank you. Charles, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental barrier and challenge in precision ag, as well as a major opportunity. On the field, on precision data systems alone, we work with over 60 different types, formats, versions, manufacturers of of field data. So we have to handle data no matter how it comes in from a farm. Some farms are using equipment that's 15 years old in terms of their monitors. They're still running, very, generation 1 equipment. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, I think it was mentioned that, about 50% of farms are still not using any form of precision agriculture, whether that's even basic yield monitoring. And those using full variable rate on all their pieces of equipment is a much smaller percentage. So you have to be compatible. It takes a lot of work. We have to have full-time, dedicated personnel who are data management experts. We also have developed a lot of software to be able to read in those files and standardize them and normalize them just on the field data collection that we have to do. Then you translate that over into the sustainability systems. And again, there's many different initiatives, many different standards, many different reporting mechanisms. We want to make our system compatible with things like field to market that have had a lot of interest and traction. But then also, our reporting system would have a system that basically stands on its own, because we're already going through the work of collecting the rest of the information. And so, we want that to report out automatically as well. So, I think just like with being able to have national data sets on things like soil and Surgo and the ArcGIS base maps, those have been tremendously important. Having public data sets around satellite imagery, because you have free satellite imagery that you can get as well from the government. That standards can really be our friends here, because standardization and public access allows for platforms to be built and allows for kind of a proliferation of platforms, which is great, and you want that. So we would we would look at this and say, both the standardization around the actual definitions and the reporting, and then what's relevant ultimately for how those assets or how those features are purchased by end buyers would be major opportunities as well. And in lieu of those being developed, we'll develop them ourselves. But again, that you have the proliferation of platforms there and from or standards, which is maybe not the most helpful at the broadest scale, but we'll keep doing that directly with our own members.
Thank you. I'm going to now ask a selfish question coming from sort of the researcher side. What's the sense of how researchers could kind of work with you, or where would research, sort of academic research, be helpful in sort of facilitating what you're doing, at the same time allowing researchers access to data, which is sort of one of the biggest constraints in terms of actually doing detailed work in this area?
Oh, I'll start. We're the yin and the yang here. The positive, and what Charles and I have both talked about, is we're blessed in the United States. We have unbelievable data resources that the public system, the research system, has created. Data layers, data repositories, algorithms, practice standards that have, I think, blessed us with to be able to take advantage of the digital ag revolution in a way that is unprecedented. But a lot of these systems then are very, as a result, data hungry. And the algorithms are very data intensive, and you need supercomputers to run, and are frankly ultimately not scalable. And are there ways to, with all the research and the science and understanding we now have around biodynamic processes and crop science, are there ways to be more efficient, where we get, I think, the same approximal recommendations, results that require ultimately less inputs? Because the inputs ultimately are very expensive to get, particularly high quality, high resolution. And then when we think globally, when we think trying to move even into Canada, you would think Canada would be a natural, and there's a huge opportunity with our neighbors north of the border, but they are not as blessed with the foundational data sets that we have in the United States. And they're very advanced economy, very advanced agronomically. And a lot of these concepts are completely transferable. And in fact, they're in many cases more progressive than they are in the United States, and by any measure. And yet we can't necessarily take all of these tools north, let alone south to Mexico, let alone to Europe, let alone to Africa, South America, et cetera. And so I think where research is, how do we transform a lot of the understandings, the deep science understandings we have into, through machine learning, through artificial intelligence, but also through better understanding of the intrinsic science. How do we make ultimately these tools more transferable by not necessarily having to be so data hungry and input intensive upfront?
Yeah, one way I would we look at that is that, you know, from first principles, basically, it comes down to the farmer being willing to share data with a third party, like a university or a company. And so the basic way our system works is that the farmer gets to choose who they share data with. They contribute data into the FBN system that basically anonymizes it in the FBN platform, but it doesn't go externally to a third party without their consent. And so what we have to do is, you know, with this, enormous, repository of data that farmers have aggregated in FBN, there's just phenomenal research potential in being able to look at that and do all types of different analyses. And it's really a question of sort of, what do you ask of it? And when you look at that data, what kind of questions do you seek to answer? And I have dozens of other charts I made me want to show here about tillage practices and trends over time, and yield by tillage practice, and yield by rotation, yield by crop or cover cropping, yield by N. There's so many different queries you can run. It's just a question of, which problems do you want to ask? And some of the things we've been able to look at with that data set are, we uncovered that 50% of genetics on the market were relabeled, or they were coming from common sources. We found price variances that were up to 700% in common inputs. You find the ability to get producers an extra 10% on yield by being able to optimize seed soil placement. And so we've been able to really find some very fundamental and very fascinating trends, not only about agronomics, but also how the market's functioning in ways that producers could never have seen or done before without aggregating that information. So I think the idea of having more, data partnerships or research partnerships is fantastic. It's all about creating a mechanism then for producers where they would opt into their data going into, anonymous, research pool that could be participating, and have universities participate and co-create with them, because there's tremendous research being done by universities in product development and genetic development, and agronomic practices, all of which could be done in concert. We've done that at a kind of narrower scale when we've introduced new products, things like biostimulants, or in some of our genetic development, where we run basically a test program at scale through our farmer partners, and that data automatically goes in through the FBN system. We're capturing it. We can use that directly for breeding and for product optimization as we're developing those new input products ourselves. But it's the same kind of opportunity exists with a lot of research that's more fundamental or earlier stage being done in the university system.
Well, it's 8:13. It's depending what time zone you're in. We're now close to 1/4 past. So I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap things up. If we didn't get to your question, or apologies, we'll pass along the questions to the panelists as well, but also please make use of the forum again on the website to post information that you'd like to post, but also post your questions, comments. The whole point of this is to start the dialogue. Let me turn things over to Sherry.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Thank you to everyone for joining us today online, and thank you to our speakers for their insights and for perseverance through all the parenting challenges and so forth. I share Jason's passion for this topic. I didn't mention I'm a 5th-generation farmer myself, and I believe in the intrinsic value of conservation, but as a farmer deal with the challenges of the market valuing of conservation. Also passionate about digital ag and all the apps and sources that I have on my own phone. So I look forward to our next 2 sessions as we continue to work together to find ways to collaborate to advance digital ag and conservation. The 2 next sessions are noted here, the 27th and the 29th. We'll be joining at the same time in the same manner, and we look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you once again to everyone for a wonderful first session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.